You might not believe it, but our volunteer board chairman has an A job. Adam Warner has been in the thick of things all this year, and this morning he's going to give us his perspective on our industry leading into the future. Adam is president of Key Equipment Finance. In this role, he's responsible for all of Key's commercial, bank-based, and manufacturer equipment lease and finance efforts. He's also responsible for overseeing the company's capital markets and specialty finance divisions. He has nearly 30 years of experience in the financial services industry. And before joining Key in 2001, he held management positions at Mellon Leasing Corporation and McDonnell Douglas Finance Corporation. Adam joined the ELFA board in 2007 and became vice chairman in 2010. He served on the executive committee and the succession and transition committee. Adam is also on the advisory board for Food for Thought Denver and is a member of the board of the University of Colorado Boulder Leeds School of Business. Ladies and gentlemen, our lead volunteer and 2014 chairman of the ELFA Board of Directors, Mr. Adam Warner. Hey.
Thank you, Woody. Thank you. Good morning. Welcome to our 53rd annual convention. Before we get started, I think as an association, I just want to recognize how fortunate we are to have a leader with the caliber, character, and stature in Washington, D.C. as Woody Sutton. He does a phenomenal job leading this association. Let's give him a big round of applause. These conventions, there's a lot of work going into these conventions, and it's done by a crackerjack ELFA staff, led by our own Leslie Sterling, Vice President of Business and Professional Development. She does a great job. Leslie, thank you. I also want to thank our sponsors and exhibitors. Without their professional and financial support, these conferences just don't happen. Let's take a look. So, our conference stats. I was hoping we were going to hit 1,000 attendees. I just learned this morning we hit 1,010 attendees at this conference. That is the highest attendance rate of our conferences in a decade. So had I known all of this, I wouldn't have asked 100 Key Equipment Finance employees to attend this conference. So after this, you're free to go. And we have 100 speakers and 19 breakout sessions, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time this morning telling you about those. I want to talk about the community service projects. What many of you may not know is that in 2008, our convention was in New Orleans, and Chairman Bill Verhelli and the ELFA staff at that time realized that there was no way to show up into New Orleans and not figure out a way to give back to that community in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And Bill, I'm very proud to tell you that that tradition has stuck. Every conference since 2008, we've had community service projects, and that's no different for this conference. We had 3 different community service projects: I Love a Clean San Diego, the Jim McGrain Charity Bike Ride, and Disabled American Veterans Build a Wheelchair event. The Disabled American Veterans Wheelchair event and I Live Clean San Diego each got $10,500 provided to them by the sponsors of those events, so I want to give a special thanks to those sponsors. Before we get started talking about leading into the future, I'd like to take a moment to remember and celebrate 2 industry icons that we lost this year. Longtime ELFA President Mike Fleming, who passed away in August, was the face of leasing in Washington, D.C. for many years. Mike served as the ELFA president from 1979, when he established the association's headquarters in Washington, D.C., until his retirement in 2006, when he then joined the Alta Group as Senior Managing Director of Client Relations. During his tenure at the ELFA, Mike transformed our organization into the leading professional trade association representing the U.S. equipment finance sector. He is incredibly knowledgeable about our industry, and he was truly dedicated to its success. I just returned from Lease Europe, and they had a wonderful tribute to Mike and recognized his many accomplishments. Mike was universally recognized as a thoughtful and caring leader, a role model and a mentor, and he will truly be missed. And in honor of Mike, we have changed the name of the Distinguished Service Award to the Michael J. Fleming Distinguished Service Award. Also, ELFA officer and board member Jim McGrain, who passed away in March, was an active volunteer who served on many committees and work groups for the association and the foundation. Jim chaired a business council steering committee, and he was in line to be the chairman of this association in 2016. As commercial division leader at Everbank, and earlier in his career at USXL, Tigris Vendor Finance, US Leasing, AT&T Capital, and Heller Financial, Jim was well known and a true success throughout our industry. Beyond that, though, Jim was an all-around outstanding human being who had a huge heart, always willing to help anyone. His positive spirit touched many people, and he lobbied for and created the charity bike ride, which we have now named the Jim McGrain Charity Bike Ride in his honor. We will miss Mike and Jim. Now, I want to take a few minutes and talk about leading into the future. That's the theme of this conference, and the intent of this conference is to provide our industry leaders tools by having outstanding speakers that are future-focused and having great breakout sessions that are future-focused to be able to arm you to be able to lead into the future. And that's not an easy proposition. We all know that the future is uncertain. If we think about the recent events that have taken place geopolitically, on the US political landscape, and economically, they're just amazing, the things that have transpired that were not foreseen. But I think there's a couple things we can bank on. One is that our world operates in cycles. Our world goes through crises and then it recovers. And our economy is no different. Our economy operates in cycles. It goes through crises and then it recovers. Speaking of crisis, former Defense Secretary Leon Panetta just last week came out and made a statement that said, "In our democracy, we govern either by leadership or by crisis. If leadership is not there, make no mistake about it, we will govern by crisis." And right now, we largely govern by crisis. And we've seen that play out on the world stage. If you think about the unforeseen recent past geopolitically, who would have thought, not even 30 years after Ronald Reagan said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," and they did, we would be entering into another Cold War with Russia. Russia would be encroaching on sovereign territories of neighboring nations and seizing their land. It's like something that reads out of a history book. And who would have thought about the rise of this so-called Islamic State? You know, it was only a few years ago the world watched in awe of Arab Spring, where citizens of Arabic countries overthrew their tyrannical leaders in hopes of a better future. But something went wrong there. A vacuum was created in those countries, and it was replaced by radicals. And those radicals are now seen across Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, all across northern Africa. We didn't see it coming. And North Korea, Kim Jong-un? Well, to be honest with you, when I finished up these remarks last week, he was still missing. They found him, unfortunately. I guess he was eating too many Oreos. They had him out of the scene for a while. They put a GPS tracker on Dennis Rodman, led him right to him. The question is, in our lifetimes, have we seen this much geopolitical strife? And how is it going to affect our country? How is it going to affect our economy? Well, that's where speaker number one comes in today. We are going to get to hear from an expert in that field, General Mike Hayden, who's going to give us insights on what's happening, why it's happening, and what we can expect when we're trying to lead into the future. What about the U.S. political landscape? That's been a little insane. You know, our country operates largely on a two-party system. It has for over 200 years. And one thing we know about a two-party system is it creates a lot of animosity. It creates a lot of strife. I read recently that General George McClellan, when he ran against Abraham Lincoln for his second term in office, publicly called Abraham Lincoln a well-meaning baboon and the original gorilla. Apparently he liked primate references. But it's different today. It's different today because our leaders back then, we would see that ugly rhetoric come up every 2 and 4 years around election cycle. But when those elections were over, our public servants felt a duty to go back to Washington, D.C. and govern. And we've even seen that in recent history. We've seen Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, adversaries, come together and govern. We've seen Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich, adversaries, come together and govern. But we don't see that anymore. We certainly didn't see it under George W. Bush, and it hasn't gotten any better under Barack Obama. The recession, the global crisis, it's created a massive division in our federal government, and it's created radically different views on how to stimulate this economy. It's created radically different views on capitalism and social programs, and there's massive division on foreign policy. And you know what? That creates a significant amount of federal policy uncertainty and gridlock in Washington, D.C. You know, I mentioned Leon Panetta earlier because he's been in the news a lot lately because he wrote a book. And he wrote a book, and in that book, there's some criticisms of the Obama administration, probably valid. There's criticisms of the current sitting Congress, definitely valid. And a reporter came up to him and said, why now? Why now would you release a book that was critical of the things that are going on in Washington, D.C.? And Panetta said, and I think it really resonates, having been in this town for 50 years, I've seen Washington at its best and Washington at its worst. Right now, I think it's Washington at its worst because of the gridlock and stalemate that's involved in this town. You know, that gridlock and stalemate weighs heavily on confidence. It weighs down consumer confidence. It weighs down business confidence. We've seen it create fickle spending patterns. That gridlock has been so impactful that Stanford University and University of Chicago came together and said, we got to figure out a way to measure this. So they created the Federal Policy Uncertainty Index. And what we see with the Federal Policy Uncertainty Index, well, you know, our friends at Keybridge Research had been tracking the Federal Policy Uncertainty Index and then been layering on it consumer confidence. And a little over a year ago, I went to our friends at Keybridge and said, let's take our industry confidence index and layer it on top of the Federal Policy Uncertainty Index. And you know what we saw? We saw the exact same thing. A direct inverse relationship between federal policy uncertainty and confidence. Every time federal policy uncertainty skyrockets, and for those of you in the back, things like the fiscal cliff, when our debt rating got downgraded, when the government shut down, federal policy uncertainty way high, confidence way low. And you know what happens when confidence gets way low? It takes billions of dollars out of GDP, and for us that's really impactful because that billions of dollars of GDP comes out of business investment. That impacts our industry. So is it going to get better on the U.S. political scene? We've got upcoming elections in November for Congress. In 2 years, we've got another presidential election. What's going to take place? That's where speaker number 2 comes in. We have political prognosticator Charlie Cook speaking tomorrow morning as our keynote speaker, and there is nobody better than Charlie Cook to tell us what's going to come out of this future election, and is it going to better or more positively impact our economy and help our recovery. And what about the economic cycles? We've gone from the largest expansion in the U.S. history economically to the Great Recession to what's now being dubbed the longest recovery. During that period of time, we saw the collapse of 100-plus-year-old financial institutions. We've seen the residential and commercial real estate markets totally collapse, rebound in some areas, not in others. The U.S. has amassed the largest federal deficit in our history, and since then, it's only come down slightly. And we know for sure in our industry, the regulation pendulum has gone completely in the other direction. So what does that mean? What is going to happen with our economy? That's where our speaker number 3 comes in. At today's foundation luncheon, we're going to hear from economist Dr. Robert Westcott of Keybridge to give us some insights on what's going to happen in the future of this economy and what can we expect so that we can better plan and lead into the future. So I think with all of this uncertainty, how do we lead into the future? Well, 2 years ago, our then chairman, Crit Dement, stood on stage and talked about uncertainty. And he talked about resilience. And Crit astutely pointed out that our industry is resilient. And he talked about the tax reform changes, the economic changes that we've gone through, the lease accounting and regulatory changes that we've gone through. And he pointed out our industry is resilient, and we have no reason to believe that our industry won't continue to be resilient. Last year, our then chairman, Rick Rimiker, talked about the critical need to adapt. Adapt to the changes that come, but more importantly, shape those changes before they arrive. So what Rick was saying is we can't just be reactive. We have to be reactive, but we can't just be reactive. We have to plan, and we have to create plans that have contingencies. And you know what? That's what this conference is about. It's providing you, the leaders of our industry, the tools so that you can plan and create contingent plans for your businesses. And speaking of planning, it's not just our businesses that need to plan. The association needs to plan. And tomorrow you're going to hear from Woody Sutton lay out the new strategic plan for the association. And there's no spoiler alert here when I say 2 things about that plan. When he worked with the executive committee and got it adopted by the board, is that plan is resilient, and that plan does give us the ability to adapt. Our association does lead into the future. We've seen this historically. Think about where our association is on the forefront of issues before they get cast in stone. I think about the federal tax policies, comprehensive tax reform, all the regulatory changes that have come and are still coming out of Dodd-Frank. We have crackerjack teams like Andy Fishburne and Richard Shanahan out there every day, mobilizing troops in Washington, D.C. and in our communities to make sure that we can shape those changes as they come. It doesn't just happen in Washington, D.C. We know we have we have 50 state and Commonwealth governments, but we have hundreds, if not thousands, of local governments. Dennis Brown, Megan Keck, mobilizing the forces, getting our member companies to meet with legislators in those communities to make sure that we can not only react, but try to modify legislation and tax reform that is being made on the local level. Standard setters. Well, for our industry, the biggest standard setters are the Financial Accounting Standards Board and the International Accounting Standards Board. Think about where we were 2 years ago when the first exposure draft on lease accounting was released. I think many of us, the first reaction was we fell off our chairs. It was so devastating potentially to our industry. But what our industry didn't do was sit back and say, how are we going to respond to those changes when they get adapted? We said, how are we going to modify those changes before they get adapted? Ralph Petta, our COO, orchestrated an unbelievable effort through our association, our member companies, other associations, to change what was to come on lease accounting standards. I know Ralph refers to it as the three amigos. He engaged Ron Hurd, Bill Bosco, John Bober to make a major impact, and look at where we're at today with lease accounting changes. We're at lease accounting changes that maybe they're not perfect, but they're manageable. They're adoptable for lessors and lessees. It's the association that's been leading and being on the forefront of making those changes before they happen. You know, the ELFA has a seat at the table, often with the help of LeasePack, in Washington, D.C. And what I've come to learn in my service to the association, and I can be very proud of, and I know you are all very proud of, is in our 53-year history, we have become known in Washington, D.C. today as a leader, not in just equipment leasing and finance, but in financial services. We have other associations that seek out working with the ELFA because of how strong our advocacy efforts are. And when you think about leading into the future, there's no way you can't think about the foundation. And celebrating its 25th anniversary this year, the foundation's whole mission is future-focused research. That's what they do. I attended the Industry Future Council this year. You know, for my business, and I think for many of your businesses, we plan on the 1 to 3 year horizon. Go to an Industry Future Council, because you start talking about what the world might look like in 10 or 15 years out, and it gets you thinking a little bit differently. But the work that's produced by the foundation is fantastic. Woody's going to talk about some of that tomorrow, but when I think of all the forward-looking things that are coming out, the economic outlooks, the momentum monitors, the monthly confidence index, constant research papers on new and expanding markets, the foundation is regularly engaging economists and futurists to help us all address what is to come. And I'm very pleased to say our members are a big part of that. They proactively lead. Obviously, we all know we unite every year on Capitol Hill, but it's more than that. We unite every week in our communities to make a difference. Our members are constantly volunteering. That's why it makes this such a fantastic association. Whether it's boards, committees, steering councils, working groups, we are always having people in this room stepping up and saying, I know I've got an A job, but I'm going to help for the greater good. That's what makes this association so fantastic. And the other thing that our members do is innovate. We are constantly innovating about new markets and new products. And we look at new technologies, whether they're for current or existing current industries or future industries, and we don't only use those new technologies, some of which you'll see showcased out by our exhibitors, but we finance those new technologies. And maybe it's in new markets, like maybe it's 3D printing, maybe it's software as a service, but we know that there's new technologies for established markets, like oil and gas or transportation. Our leaders lead and innovate. But it can't just be about the people in this room and how we lead and how we innovate. We have to think about how do we lead and innovate for future generations. You know, this is a problem that our executive committee took up over a year ago. How do we better reach out to academia? How do we better reach out to other financial service-related industries and attract new and emerging talent into our industry? Well, our executive committee took action and created a subcommittee. And if you know anything about associations, we love to create committees. That committee was spearheaded by Judd Snyder. And Judd and his team have done a wonderful job. That committee got a working group of emerging talent leaders together this past June in Washington, D.C. at Capital Connections and discussed important issues on emerging talent to Gen X and, more importantly, to Gen Y. What Judd and his team came back to the executive committee with a recommendation, and that recommendation back in August was, we think we've got traction with this emerging talent working group that showed up in Washington, D.C. We think this ought to be part of the fabric of our association, and we want to turn that working group into a permanent council of our association, the Emerging Talent Advisory Council. And that was approved by the executive committee. It was endorsed by the board just this past weekend, and that is now underway. We have an Emerging Talent Advisory Council. It is starting with 2-year terms. They're going to be meeting monthly via web calls. They'll be connecting, certainly through social media, and they will meet annually in Washington, D.C. And their job is to develop and formalize action plans to achieve the objectives of attracting more emerging talent into the member companies of our associations. So we are leading into the future, and we're thinking about the future on other levels. So in closing, this conference, it's about leading into the future. We're looking at world events, we're talking about US politics, we're learning about economic cycles, and we have fantastic content in our breakout sessions. So much of it is future related. Just as an example, the future of social media, alternative financing and the future of equipment finance, adapting to the future of transportation finance, leadership and human capital management, and the changing face of small business are all just a sampling of some of the breakout sessions that are future focused. So take advantage of those breakout sessions. We have great speakers. I hope you enjoy these speakers as they talk about future related topics, and let's have a great convention. Thank you.